Well, good morning, everyone. Again, Rob Satloff, sitting for the first time in ages in our Washington Institute offices downtown at 19th and L here in Washington. I'm really delighted that you could join us this morning for this extremely special event. More special than I anticipated when we organized it, not least because I think that our guests just got off a phone call between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel. So the timeliness of this could not be more appropriate. Let me get right into it. I'm thrilled today to be able to welcome to this special session of the Board of Trustees of the Washington Institute, Brett McGurk. Brett is the National Security Council's coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. In that position, he is President Biden's senior advisor for all things related to the Middle East, the entire region, Morocco to Oman and everything in between. He is an attorney by training, well known to this audience after serving as the presidential envoy to the Coalition Against the Islamic State in the Obama administration, with experience in the region and especially in Iraq that dates back to the Coalition Provisional Authority in the early days following the 2003 invasion. Among the other things for which he is known to our audience, he is Barbara Leaf's boss, at least for now. And that gives him a very special responsibility. I really want to thank you, Brett. I know that these are busy times. Thank you for joining us today. You have the Board of Trustees and my Washington Institute colleagues on the line, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you for a moment.
Well, Rob, I'm honored to be here. I'm sorry this has been rescheduled a couple times. I'm sorry. I think at the back end here, I have to cut it a little short to talk to the Egyptians. But yeah, Barbara's the boss of everybody. So Barbara's the big boss. She's it's so great to have her here working just side by side with me, and it'll be even better to have her over at State. I was going to talk about the broader region, what we're doing. I just got back from a trip, but given the events, let me just, and given the audience with the sophistication that everyone I'm speaking with, let me try to explain what we've been doing and how we have played this over the last 10, 11 days.
And let me just interrupt and say that this is a totally off-the-record session.
Yes.
And I'm counting on all of our participants to abide by those rules in our longstanding tradition.
I very much appreciate that, because that allows me to speak obviously a little more freely. So I can go back to the events of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem and that, but let me just focus on the Hamas conflict, because that's what we're dealing with right now. When this kicked off with Hamas launching rockets at Jerusalem, trying to present themselves as the defenders of Jerusalem, and then of course the rockets at Tel Aviv, obviously we knew Israel will respond decisively. They have every right to do so. We made that very clear, and that's a bedrock commitment from President Biden. And we've seen him regularly throughout this crisis. We also made the judgment in looking at past Hamas-Israel conflicts that we hope that this would not get into something significantly protracted, such as 2014, which went on 51 days, and that our ability to work closely with the Israelis as they went through this campaign and to use our influence and guidance to the extent we can as a friend, not just from here in the White House, but from the Pentagon with Secretary Austin and Benny Gantz and General Kohavi and General Milley. This has been very full spectrum, that we should in public be firmly behind the Israelis. Obviously, the pressure and calls through the Security Council and everything else, we made a judgment and a decision, which I still believe is absolutely right. We will not support action on this issue in the Security Council. Calls for a ceasefire in the Security Council, given that there's no symmetry between Hamas launching indiscriminate rocket attacks at Israeli cities and Israel's right to defend itself. So we blocked action in the Security Council, and also, of course, very measured in our language and making clear Israel has a right to defend itself. Behind the scenes and privately with the Israelis, we have also been talking to them regularly about their objectives, the duration, scope of this operation. We did recommend through our military experts that a ground operation probably would not be a great idea. and have been discussing with the Israelis consistently about how this would be brought to a conclusion. It is our judgment that that approach, rather than banging our shoe on the podium or on the table in the Security Council calling for ceasefires, is more likely to deliver a result to a sustainable ceasefire than taking a different approach. And so that is what we have done. And our conversations with these Israelis have been very constructive. I think, obviously, the pressure has been building internationally and here. I do believe now, and I don't want to get ahead of things, we have a readout from the president's call. I think we are now we're in a wind down phase. Discussions between the Egyptians and the Israelis have been very intense. We've been a facilitator of that process. And I'm fairly confident now that there will be a wind down and ultimately a ceasefire, for lack of a better word, whether it's over the next couple of days or so by the end of the week. I think we're kind of moving in that direction. And I think that's positive, because I do think just the domestic politics of this, we can't ignore it. It is concerning when we see in the HVAC and other places questioning just very straightforward arms sales to the Israelis that, of course, were in the queue far before this ever started. And so we don't think that's particularly healthy. And so to get this into a ceasefire sooner rather than later, I think, is an objective that we share now very much with the Israelis. So we'll see how this plays out. I think if we do get into a wind down period, which I think we're now entering, and a ceasefire in place, whether it's by the end of the week or over the weekend, we're also prepared in parallel as the United States to come in a more visible way, particularly on whether it's humanitarian assistance, other things, which we'll of course do through the UN in full coordination with the Israeli government, and a host of other issues, including our relations with the Palestinians, which were totally severed in the former administration. That's something we're also turning back on. So bottom line, we have been foursquare behind the Israelis in public. We've stood with them in the Security Council. And that one of the reasons for that is so we can ensure that we have our private channels of communication that are frank, constructive, and we don't have the distraction of a public dispute or spat. So that's how we played this. If you look at the model of the 2014 conflict, very different. The United States very publicly calling for ceasefires, which didn't actually produce any ceasefires. So we'll see how this plays out. I think we've played this right. And obviously President Biden, who is just the affection for Israel. When you're around him talking about these issues, you can feel that it's in his blood. But also, we do recognize it would not be in Israel's interest or anyone's interest for a protracted campaign. And so, the sooner this ends, we think the better. So that's kind of where we are. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have, Rob.
All right. Thank you, Brett. Let me just ask everyone online, if you want to try to filter things into this conversation, please use the Q&A function. I have already prepared considerably for this conversation, but I welcome your own input into the back and forth that I'll be having with Brett. Brett, just on this issue, it's no surprise that this wasn't what the administration hoped for. That you didn't want to have a Middle East, an Arab-Israeli-Palestinian crisis. This wasn't really on the agenda of the trip you took last week. So before we get into the observations from the trip you took last week, how do we actually win the ceasefire? You referred to 2014. It created a whole mechanism for getting stuff in for reconstruction for Gaza. Clearly that failed. I mean, clearly whatever we did 7 years ago let enormous items get diverted into building tunnels and building rockets and not serving the Palestinian people. So what are we thinking about doing differently this time? And are we actually willing ourselves, perhaps against our original judgment, to roll up our sleeves and get engaged in order to make sure that what happened last time doesn't happen again?
So let me start with one of my top line points that I would have given even if we weren't in this crisis, this point that we're deprioritizing the Middle East. So the point I make, and this reflects discussions with the president and others, we're not deprioritizing the Middle East. it depends on what baseline you're coming at. If you past administrations, really the last three, had a transformational agenda in the Middle East, kind of very, very, I would say, unachievable, very ambitious objectives. I think we are trying to get back to just the first principles of statecraft, the alignment of ends and means, the importance of partners and allies. Some problems have to be managed that can't be solved, and setting objectives that are more achievable. And that's not to say we're not being ambitious. If there's an opportunity, such as, and a really hard one, is the challenge in Yemen, we are making tremendous efforts to try to wind down that conflict. In Libya, another very difficult, almost impossible position. Joey Hooder, acting assistant secretary, was just there. We have an interim government. We're putting our shoulder into that. We are encouraging all the kind of centrifugal forces in the region that have polarized things over the last 5-6 years in particular. We are encouraging the nascent dialogues that are underway. That's not just because of U.S. encouragement, it's because of post-COVID and how these capitals see their own internal situations. But the Iran-Saudi talks, we're very realistic about what that can produce, but we think it's good that they're talking. The Egypt-Turkey talks, which are now underway, they haven't had any contact really in 4 to 5 years, Emirates and Turks and others. So trying to nurture this into a centripetal direction as we come out of the COVID period and reduce the risk of new conflicts. On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think we need to be honest about what we inherited. And we inherited a situation with almost entirely severed ties to the Palestinians. All aid had been cut, as you know, no consul general. And so we did make a decision to work through these issues systematically. So anyone who's worked in the US government before knows you can't just turn a light switch and turn these things back on, nor do we think that would have been smart. But starting with the renewal of assistance, including security assistance we announced in April, just renewing the dialogue and diplomatic engagement, and eventually leading to some of the harder issues, which I think are very much on the agenda. We have a very good ambassador in the queue for Israel that's in the pipeline, so that will pop out, which I think obviously will be good. But on this larger set of issues, I do think we have to look at what happened in the last 6 weeks, and we could see this coming. There was a confluence of events. Abbas's decision not to hold elections, which he did because I think he thought Fatah's divided and Hamas is actually well organized. So by his own accord, decided not to hold elections, blaming the Israelis and not allowing the vote in East Jerusalem. That was on April 28th. That we know riled up Hamas significantly. We then had this confluence in the calendar of Laylat al-Qadr coming 48 hours before Jerusalem Day, which was and we could see this coming on the calendar. And we discussed it with the Israelis in some detail when they were here for the strategic dialogue, which was 3 weeks ago, a week before the trip I took. And then the Sheikh Jarrah eviction situation, which was further instigated by some very right-wing members of the Knesset. And then you had this kind of confluence of events, which was unfortunate. We were aware of it. We discussed it with the Israelis. The Israelis did take some significant steps, rerouting the Jerusalem Day Parade, really for the first time in history, delaying any decision on Sheikh Jarrah, which we think was the right thing to do. But Hamas triggered this conflict with the rockets towards Jerusalem and then Tel Aviv. So that's a long way of saying I think we have to be very mindful of these little sparks and given the kindling. And I think once we have an ambassador in place, we have a team in place, we'll be able to do that. But you ask a good question, and we've been having a discussion about what we do coming out of the ceasefire. We have a number of ideas. I think you'll see us very visibly engaged on this, more so than we have been in the crisis, where we've been doing a lot of this quietly behind the scenes. But you ask a good question because we can't have mechanisms that simply reinforce the status quo. I don't think this formula of Qatar paying $20 million a month or whatever it is to Gaza, kind of paying for peace, seems to be effective. So we've been discussing with the Israelis what this might look like, how the Palestinian Authority might be involved in a constructive way, what the role will be for the UN. But I don't have a great answer for it right now. But I agree with your basic point that the status quo, or just going back to how it was, I don't think is great. You can't have Hamas and Islamic Jihad sitting in Gaza with thousands and thousands of rockets where this can kick off again. So you ask a good question, and I think we're going to need the wisdom of the experts in this town who've been working on this for decades, like yourself and so many, I think, that are listening to us as we move forward on this. But if we get into a ceasefire, I don't knock on wood here, but if we get into a ceasefire, I think you'll see from Tony Blinken on down a fairly visible U.S. engagement to try to address these issues, including in Gaza, in a way that does not just kind of revert to the status quo that we inherited.
All right, thank you. Let me take this discussion in two directions. First, into the Iran direction. One way to look at what's going on, it doesn't tell the whole picture, but one way to look at it is another Iranian-supported terrorist group or proxy is active against an American friend or American partner, an American ally, like we've seen in Iraq, like we've seen in Yemen. And this occurs while the United States is indirectly negotiating with Iran on the return to the Iran nuclear deal. How do you see this set of actions by Iran, and how do we approach what Iran is doing in the region? What is our strategy for addressing Iran's regional behavior?
So let me say one thing. There will be no, in the Biden administration, decision that, well, we're in talks in Vienna, so therefore let's hold back on something we might do on Iran in the region. So the two, we're taking them totally separately. That's what Iran does. That's what we're going to do. So we've had a number of attacks in Iraq in the past 6 weeks or so. We've demonstrated we'll respond to those in the past. We will respond to those. It might be things people see. It might be things people don't see. So very committed to that and to ensuring that our deterrence and that they know that we're prepared to act, particularly in defense of our people. We're foursquare behind that. I can talk about Yemen and Saudi Arabia and what we're doing to help the Saudis. They're now defeating about 85% of these missiles and UAVs. That's gone up significantly. And we're going to continue to do that while we are not supporting Saudi Arabia in offensive operations, meaning taking territory in Yemen. We're very much supporting them in UAVs, explosive boats, missile networks, and everything else. And actually, I think that cooperation has increased over the past couple of months. I think what's happening now happened specific to the situation in Jerusalem and over the last month. But no doubt these groups get support from the Iranians. So I will just say that anything that happens in Vienna on the nuclear side will not have an effect on our determination to support our friends and allies that are facing the IRGC and these threats. We've made clear to the Israelis throughout, when we talk on the nuclear accord, that Israel's freedom of action is something we fundamentally support. Israel's right to defend itself. We do ask for coordination, and we have very good channels of communication open, particularly for what the Israelis do in Syria, because we do take on some of the risk for Israel's freedom of action, because when Iran looks for a target to strike back, they see us. So therefore, that's an ongoing conversation with the Israelis, but I think it's been a very good one. But I would just say there's no holding back. Just because we have talks going on in Vienna, we're not going to say, well, then we shouldn't do X, Y, Z. On Vienna, I honestly don't know what's going to happen. We debate this every day. I am increasingly of the view this will be difficult to do before Iran's presidential election. One reason we're making a run at it, I don't want to go off on the JCPOA because that can take a long time, but let me just specifically say what we've done since we came in. We inherited an Iranian nuclear program that truly is, breaking out of the box. And when we have meetings on the situation, the most alarmed about the situation are the nuclear proliferation experts at the Department of Energy and elsewhere, given that every day these centrifuges spin, the more uranium that Iran is collecting, they gain irreversible knowledge towards potential weaponization. And that is what we inherited, and it continues to get worse every day. So we kind of have three options: keep maximum pressure and hope eventually that reverses and the Iranians basically give up. The experts who are looking at this say that's not going to happen. That is the Israeli view. We just have a kind of an analytical baseline disagreement on where that leads. A second option, which honestly we tried, but I think the Iranians saw it as too cute by half. We'll do a little bit of sanctions relief, and then you stop all your most provocative activities and you cap your various certain nuclear activities that basically put a ceiling on everything. That was flatly rejected and would have gone nowhere. So the third option is we try to get back in the JCPOA to put a constraint on the program, but with a commitment for follow-on discussions, given that we recognize that we need an improvement in the deal. And that's the framework in which we're now operating. But within that framework, we have not lifted a single sanction. We have not released any even humanitarian pots of funds that are out there that I think even the former administration by now probably would have released, because we have no legal ability to keep the South Koreans, for example, from releasing money in a significant reduction exception account. We haven't taken any of that pressure off. And we have conveyed in Vienna, let's make a final point on this, because I think the stories from a few weeks ago that this is really galloping forward. We did convey in Vienna at the urgent, with a recommendation from our allies in the Vienna process to put on the table, if you, Iran, do everything you need to do, this is what we would consider return to compliance on our side. So, put that on the table. Here it is. And now you would need to do the following, like 30 things. We did that because we thought it helps unify the P5+1, and we are unified now. So we flipped the script in which we're an isolated party. Now Iran truly is an isolated party. And the onus is now on Iran to come and say, yes, we're willing to do the following things, which they haven't done yet. So while it is fair to say that in Vienna, we have put on the table what a return to compliance would look like, we have not taken off any sanctions or pressure. So that's where we are. And I honestly, I think this is very difficult to see coming together before the Iranian presidential election, but we'll see. It's not impossible.
I appreciate that explanation of where we are. There's sort of one question it would be great to have sort of the authoritative answer to on this, which is, it's the leverage question, and you've heard it 1,000 times. But from the outside, I don't think there's been an authoritative answer to it, which is, assume that you can get back into the JCPOA. What leverage is retained to compel the Iranians to do deal 2.0? Or what interest would they have in doing a deal 2.0?
Number one, the commitment that they'll never have a nuclear weapon, and including if they move towards weaponization. I mean, we don't say this publicly, I guess, but the military option is very much on the table. I mean, we discussed that with the Israelis. So if they actually start to move towards weaponization, there's just no question we're never going to allow that to happen, ever. Second, we actually take some encouragement. You'd have to talk to Rob Malley and the team about the details on this. The Iranians are asking for a number of things that I think they wish they had asked for in the JCPOA: correspondent accounts and the ability to exchange currencies and do things to make their economy work. Because even under the JCPOA, they had such a difficult time making any of this work. So the sense from our team out there is that we actually have a lot of tools in our kit in a follow-on discussion, even on the economic side, not to mention the sanctions that remain in place on counterterrorism and humanitarian missiles and other things. So we think that the Iranian economy, even if in a back return to JCPOA scenario, just isn't going to work to the extent the Iranians need. We will not be in the posture of trying to gin up business for Iran or trying to encourage. That's just not something we're going to do in the event we do to return to compliance. So we think we have enough tools, and particularly with the unified, with the E3 and others, we're very unified on this, that we would have to be in a negotiation for extended sunsets and other things. So I don't know if that gives you the definitive answer, but I think what has come out of the talks in Vienna is that Iran has approached us about a number of additional elements that they think they need to really have an economy that is working. But look, they would return to being able to sell oil and other things. So there's no question there would be an economic benefit. But we do think we would retain significant pressure to at least extend the deal. So you keep this cap on their nuclear activities, for the foreseeable future. So if in a return to compliance scenario, it's in place through 2030, at least anything that would allow them to move to weaponization. And then we would just work to continue to extend that. So that's the theory. I know this is far from perfect, but we're welcome to other ideas. The one thing I think I have not found anyone to say, yeah, that's probably going to work, is if you just keep on maximum pressure. If you keep on maximum pressure, the nuclear program continues to accelerate. And that's kind of the hand we've been dealt. And so, we've been trying various ways. One reason we didn't move rapidly because we did try some other things. So anyway, I don't mean to dance around your question. It's a hard one, but that's currently the assessment we have.
Okay, fair enough. Actually, that's about as cogent an answer to the leverage question that I've heard. So thank you. I know that our time is limited. I want to touch on a number of other topics in the area under your purview. I know there's a Syria policy review underway, and lots of unanswered questions about where we're heading on that thorny topic. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Are we trying to stop Arab countries from reconciling with Assad? Are we committed to the deployment of forces in the Northeast? What is our long-term objective? Has it shifted from administration to administration on Syria?
Again, another impossible problem. And 10 years into the Civil War, we are doing a very bottom-up review of this situation. And but a couple things. Yes, we are committed to staying, and that's number one. And one of the messages we carried, particularly to Iraq, is that we're committed to staying in Iraq and in Northeast Syria. The mission is an ISIS-focused mission. That is our legal basis. That's what gives us a coalition. That's what gives us legitimacy and staying power. But of course, under that umbrella, there are other things that we can do. So we are very much committed to maintaining that presence. That's very important. Together with that, we will have some engagements upcoming with the Russians. Jake is seeing his counterpart next week. Of course, the president, still not confirmed, but might see President Putin. And one of the agenda items is, as we used to say, stay away from our forces. Okay, or stay away from your forces, but you stay away from ours. And if we have demonstrated, if you do threaten us, obviously we have a right to defend ourselves. That's the last thing we want with the Russians. But we are committed to staying and to just reduce the risks to the presence to our forces from the Russians and other actors. So that's number one. Number two, I think we have to be very realistic about the prospects of 2254 and the UN Security Council resolution, which I was a part of negotiating many, many years ago, leading to any sort of an outcome. That does not mean we will never, I think, engage with Assad. We're very clear about this. We have encouraged the Arab states not to give away anything for free, kind of hold your horses here. We hear it from all Arab capitals. And so it's kind of this like tidal wave that we are saying, hold your horses and let's organize an approach that would demand a few key things. And obviously, from the Israeli vantage point, it is a significant reduction and ultimate removal of the IRGC and other Iranian-backed forces from Syria. Whether that's possible or not, I think that is worth something to have very much on the agenda when Arab capitals are talking about approaching Damascus. So what we're trying to do through our strategic review and our diplomatic engagement in the region is to recognize this reality, corral it, and try to come up with a realistic agenda that can support our interests. And of our interests in Syria, there are three significant ones. Number one, the counterterrorism situation is something we can't take our eye off of. Second is Iran's buildup in Syria, which obviously the Israelis have been very effective in their campaign that began in 2018. We fully support that, and that will continue. And also the humanitarian situation in Syria is just disastrous. So in the last 12 months, there's been less violence in Syria than at any time in the 10-year civil war, but the humanitarian situation has significantly eroded. So one of the conversations with the Russians here coming up, and really a test for the Russians, um, is the renewal of UN mandated border crossings, particularly into Idlib province. There's only one left, but we're going to try to expand those, at least as an opening bid, to have not one, but three. And we would be willing to discuss at this point some problems that are existing in regime areas. No reconstruction, nothing like that. But what we're hearing from, like the head of the Red Cross, for example, came to us and said, look, because of the chilling effect of your sanctions, we can deliver water and water bottles or in a water truck, but we cannot repair a water pipe or repair a water treatment facility. Our sanctions shouldn't cover that type of activity. We can clarify that, this kind of very basic early recovery. And under a humanitarian umbrella, given the interest to just improve the livelihoods of Syrians, that's something I think we'd be willing to discuss. But only if the Russians need to keep these border crossings open. We're very concerned they are prepared to veto the renewal of the Idlib border crossing, which would create a just worsening humanitarian catastrophe with 3 million people in Idlib province. So that's kind of where we are. We got a CT challenge. We have an Iranian buildup challenge, and we have a significant humanitarian challenge. And we want to really try to tackle those while we think through the larger political issues and reform in Damascus, which I just think we have to be realistic, are kind of on the longer term horizon.
Just to add one word about this, when you say CT challenge, does this put on your old hat of counter ISIS? And how seriously do we view the ISIS challenge? One hears lots of reports of still ISIS activity, and how seriously do we view this?
Yeah, so it's a local insurgency in both Iraq and Syria. It is not the 2014-15 where you had tens of thousands of foreign fighters coming in and out of Syria, and you had the attacks in Europe and everything else. So that we have done a pretty good job at what we wanted to do, which was make this more of a local challenge. But it's still there. And so very much recognize that we can't just leave. And I think we tried to design this in a way back then that would be small, sustainable, efficient, effective with a big coalition. It got a little disjointed, I think, over the last 4 years because the mission got a little disjointed. Is it ISIS? Is it Iran? Is it other things? And when the military mission starts to shift towards Iran and that perception is there, you lose your coalition. It increases risk to our forces. So we are trying to make clear we're here for ISIS. And just getting back to that first principle, because that is why we're there. And that gives us staying power. But with the unstated fact that if we're there for ISIS, there's a lot of other things we can do. And we want to stay. That is really the key point. I think our presence in Iraq, we've tried to stabilize it by messaging deterrence to the Iranians, doing a lot of other things, and some work with the Iraqi political actors. Iraq will have an election in October, which is a real inflection point of which way that goes. I came out of the country, I was only there for 2 days, but somewhat encouraged that while the Iranian-backed parties are very well organized, the mechanism for forming a government, you'll have enough kind of Shia nationalists, Sunnis, and Kurds that the government that comes out of that, we would love to have Prime Minister Khatami with a second term, whether or not it's him or someone like him that at least supports our presence. I think there's a decent chance of that happening, which is obviously very important. So we'll see. But we are committed as a policy matter from the White House to staying because we have significant interest in Iraq and Syria, including the ISIS problem you just mentioned.
Very good. I know your time is short. I have a couple of the topics I just want to touch on.
Sure.
We won't be able to get in depth, but I do want to touch on them before we conclude. In our earlier discussion about Israelis, Palestinians, ceasefire, the next step, one piece that didn't come up is what other Arab states can do. And here I wanted to specifically ask you about the extent to which the administration views the utility and the wisdom of deepening and broadening the Abraham Accord states and their relations with Israel, and Is that something that's on our agenda? And to what extent can that be used even to enhance and strengthen this sort of core Israeli-Palestinian agenda, perhaps in boosting the PA? One can imagine all sorts of creative ideas here, but it only begins if there's the idea that enhancing this is a priority.
So let me start from Israel. Let me broaden out. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a talk to the foreign ambassadors. He made a few points that coming out of it, he didn't convey that you might be entering a wind down phase, obviously, in that audience, but he did say that we're looking to confirm status quo of Haram al-Sharif and Temple Mount, strengthening the Palestinian Authority, mobilizing Arab states for investment in the West Bank, ensuring the Palestinian Authority has a role to play in Gaza, humanitarian reconstruction, all of which are things that we support, which get to this larger issue. Look, fundamental, 100% supportive of the Abraham Accord process. We've discussed this with the Moroccans, Emiratis, and Bahrainis in some depth. Sudan is not quite over the final finishing line. It's about there. The events over the last week, I think, set it back a little bit, but I think we'll get there. And so 100% moving forward on this. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is the big one. And I'll just confirm to this audience, I don't think it's a secret, we're committed to doing anything we can. And that it's not going to be immediate. This is a period of, this might be a period of years. But we are confident that with some good, quiet diplomacy, we can move this forward, and some other opportunities as well. In the midst of this crisis, it's also presented an opportunity. You just see how you have new tools in the toolkit. We have heard from the Emiratis, Bahrainis, Moroccans, and the Abraham Accord states. The Gaza conflict's one thing, and you know their views on Hamas, but Jerusalem is something very different, and Sheikh Jarrah and all that. And so when we hear from those capitals about these issues, we say, well, that's great. Tell your Israeli friends. It's very good for them to hear from you about this. So I think this is a positive dynamic that coming out of this, we obviously want to fully use to the advantage of Israelis and Palestinians in helping to stabilize things, but also working to expand the normalization deals. We do make clear to the Israelis and Prime Minister in the calls between Biden and Netanyahu, while we're fully supportive of this, it's not an end run around the fundamental issue of Israeli and Palestinian peace. And again, I don't begrudge former administrations. I try not to. I've served in 4 now, but I just think the approach of totally cutting ties with the Palestinians, at least I've been dealing with this now in real time. It was not helpful. I think we're rebuilding the muscle memory, and we have longstanding relationships. But you can't. There's no kind of end run to the fundamental nature of the issue. But anyway, yes, fully supportive and looking to expand where possible.
I happen to agree with your assessment on that completely. I actually think that there's what can be done with the Arab Peace Coalition to help what you're trying to do on the Israeli-Palestinian
right
as well. One word which hasn't come up in this conversation, there's been a number, but one word that hasn't come up, which is high on President Biden's agenda globally, is democracy and human rights. How do we do everything that you've just laid out with countries that, shall we say, are not high on the list on Freedom House's human rights list? Where does democracy and human rights fit into the agenda you've just outlined?
Well, again, with the we don't have a transformative agenda for the Middle East. I think we're being very realistic on that. But we do raise the issues of human rights and values in our engagement. So very early on with the Saudis, there were 3 American citizens who were detained, we thought unjustly. We did raise that they've been released. We raised the case of Hussein Haflul and others, very high profile cases. And I think we've seen some progress on there. I was just in Cairo, similar with the Egyptians. What was interesting is that the Egyptians with us, kind of their first issue was human rights. It's very interesting. Obviously they know, but they're coming out with a new human rights strategy. They're going to roll out here over the coming weeks and kind of made the case of what they're trying to do. We met quietly with a number of civil society activists in Cairo, and heard a very clear message from them, which I thought was interesting, that do not treat the Egyptian government as a pariah, because we need American influence with the government to help us in real time. It's a bit of a different message than you sometimes get from some of the interested parties here. So it's on the agenda. It is discussed in every meeting. And I will say, I found we have a receptive audience on it. I mean, so long as we're not pushing something that is totally unrealistic, I think these countries recognize they obviously have a significant room for improvement, put it that way. But when there's specific cases, we raise it and we try to get results. I think we've actually had some of which we talk about publicly, some of which we don't. So anyway, look, it's a work in progress. But you take Egypt, such a complicated, so many issues with the Egypt relationship, from human rights to purchasing Su-35s, which I'm increasingly confident they're not going to do. But also, we've seen in this crisis, I have a call with the Egyptians coming up momentarily here. They've been essential. It's been Egypt, not Qatar, not anyone else. It's been Egypt in the Gaza conflict that has been critical. And if this does, in fact, wind down over the next couple of days, it'll be because of Egyptian facilitation. And so that's also something I think we have to keep in mind.
Just to telescope out before we conclude, great power competition sort of colors American foreign policy these days. With your focus on the Middle East, do you view the Middle East as being a theater of this competition or a distraction from this competition? And how does it factor into what you do?
A great question. I'll just speak. I worry a little bit about the framing, kind of an ideological framing. Look, talking to experts on the Middle, if you take that kind of ideological broad frame to problems in the Middle East, I think you're going to drive yourself into dangerous corners. Mm-hmm. You take a country like UAE. China's the largest trading relationship with the UAE. We're not going to change that. They have close relationships with the Russians. What I think we need to do, and we are doing, is drawing specific lines and having a conversation about the specific concerns about specific types of relationships, whether it's obviously military intelligence or certain technology relationships, where frankly, we've all gone through this awakening on China, I think, in recent years, and it's very ripe in the Middle East. This is a conversation we've been having with Israel over a number of years, but I have found in the Gulf, a real I'll give an anecdote because I'm off the record, but a very senior Emirati official talking about the relationship with China brought up the example of, he said, a friend of mine, Jack Ma, like, look what the Chinese are doing to one of their own, and what does it potentially mean to a small country like us if we go down a certain road? I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. When some countries in the Middle East talk about 5G technology with Huawei, and they like it because Huawei offers a back door, which they like for law enforcement and security needs, well, who do you think is holding that back door? It's like, oh, yeah. So I think we need to be careful not to come at this with some broad ideological prism, which I think can drive us into a dangerous spot, but use our comparative advantage with these countries where we have it and our relationships, which are so deep. And I think one benefit we have in this administration is, from Lloyd Austin to Bill Burns to across to Tony Blinken, across the board, we have deep relationships in the region. So we can have this very specific discussion about what it is about the China challenge and your relationship with China that we find a concern, not just because we're the US, because it is actually a threat to your sovereignty down the road, and just very specific examples. I have found a receptiveness to that discussion. I think it's very rich, very timely, and I think that's how we intend to go about it.
All right. Well, thank you. We are 3 minutes past the time I said I'd let you go. I want to thank you very much. I hope this is just the first of a number of interactions that we can have, that we will have with the passage of time. We look forward to being of support and help in any way that we can, because you have quite an agenda.
Well, I would love, I just say, I would love to sit around a round table in person and take like 2 hours. I really hope we could do that soon. It'd be great benefit to me and my team. And so hopefully I would really welcome the opportunity to do that.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much, Brett McGurk,
Okay.
President, Special
Thanks.
Advisor on the Middle East. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this special program at the Washington Institute.